How many of you know Jesus did a lot of miracles during his time on earth? No? Nobody knows that? Okay. Well, I'm telling you that. Jesus did a lot of miracles during his time on earth. There was a couple that he did that involved miraculous provision through multiplication. Feeding of the 4,000, feeding the 5,000. If you go to the Old Testament, you've got the widow with the jar of oil. And most people would call those a time of abundance because there was a lot. But during that time, Jesus is still concerned about the stuff that seems insignificant and worthless. The leftovers. The stuff that's left after the miracle. Father, I thank you that we're all gathered here today. And Father, right now I pray that you'll, Father, communicate through me, Father, what you've downloaded into my spirit this morning. Father, help the people here to understand it, Father, the way that you've shown it to me. Father, help us to see things how you see them, Father, so we don't waste the miracles that are in our own lives. Amen. We are going to look at the feeding of the 5,000 this morning. And this is one of those events that happens in every gospel. As a result, I had to pick one because I'm not going to read all of them. And I've picked John, and you'll see why shortly. But for the time being, I'm going to turn to John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. And I am reading out of the NIV version. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Verse 7, Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a small boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. I'm going to stop there. The same event is also found in Matthew 14:13 to 21 that some of you might have heard quoted last week. I must admit, I nearly freaked out when he quoted that verse, and then the one about the oil, and I'm going, he's stealing my notes for next week. But we didn't. We're talking about 2 different things. Mark chapter 6, verse 30 to 44, Luke chapter 9, verses 10 to 17, and John 6, 1 to 14. If you read all 4, they're all slightly different. John, in his typical way of doing things, is more different than all the others. But they all more or less have the same base story. And if you combine them all together, you actually get a really good overview of exactly what would have happened. But I'm going to go out of John because John's the only one that mentions leftovers. Okay. So we've seen there's a miracle. The miracle was multiplying the food. We all in agreement there? But we've multiplied something. 3 things that were required for this miracle. Firstly, The miracle required a situation that required a miracle. Now that might sound like an oxymoron and a contradiction in terms, but you can't have a miracle unless you have a situation that needs one. If you don't have a situation that needs a miracle, whatever happens is not a miracle. So in this scenario, we have a heap of people that are sitting there. What John doesn't say in his version of events is that the people had been with Jesus all day. I think it's Matthew that covers that, or Mark, one of the two, maybe even Luke. They'd been with the people all day, and Jesus was concerned that they would faint on the way home. So this wasn't just a case of, these people have been with me for 2 hours and I want to give them something to eat before they go. It was a legitimate concern regarding the safety and well-being of those people who didn't have the luxury of jumping into their car and driving home. They had to walk. Okay, maybe some of them had a horse or donkey, but still, they had to walk. That uses energy, and if you faint on the way home and something like that, you can't just pick up your phone and call 000 and get an ambulance to come and pick you up. So there's a legitimate concern here. That's the situation that required the miracle. Second thing, as part of point 1b, the disciples acknowledged that the situation was impossible. You might have a situation that requires miraculous intervention, but whatever you don't acknowledge that situation requires miraculous intervention and is out of your control, you're not getting any miracle. It's gone very quiet. Okay. The impossibility of the situation is what made the events a miracle. Because no human can take those 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed 5,000 men plus women and children. The fact that Jesus did that makes it a miracle. But the only reason why it happened is because the disciples acknowledged that they couldn't do it. Philip said it'd take half a year's wage to give them all a bite. I think one of the other versions, I think it's Peter or someone that says, where will we get this amount of bread? So they're not even worried about the money. Like, yeah, okay, the money is a problem, but that's like the second problem. We've got to find somewhere with this much bread to start with. So they've got 2 realms of impossibility. 1, they don't have the money, and 2, they don't have anywhere that sells that much bread. Just saying, this impossible situation is becoming more impossible. So that was the first thing that's required before Jesus performed the miracle. It needed a situation. There we go. Second thing, the miracle required something that was insufficient. Again, if you had a sufficient amount of food, you wouldn't need a miracle. But the point is, this miracle was about multiplication. If you look in the book of Acts, I think it's for the first 4 or 5 chapters, it mentions about people being added to the church. Now we're going to have a quick grade 3 maths lesson here. If you start with nothing and you add 3 to it, what do you get? 3. If you start with nothing and multiply it by 3, what do you have? Nothing. So if you're going to have a miracle of multiplication, you have to have something in the first place to be multiplied. Because it doesn't matter if you ask God to multiply it by 1,000, if it's nothing, you still end up with nothing. Haley and I have a running joke when I ask her to do the flyers for me for youth. And it goes along the lines of, yep, I can do that, can I have a pay rise? And I say, sure, I'll give you a 200% pay rise. Because here's the thing, 200% of 0 is still 0. I can tell her I'm giving her a 1,000% pay rise and it's fine. Because it's still 0, at least in my books. I'm not sure that she feels the same way, but that's okay. It's not a discussion for this morning. So the point is, you have to have something. Look at the woman in Elisha's day with the jar of oil. That's in 2 Kings 4, 1-7 for those that are taking notes. I'm not going to read it out. But she went to Elisha and basically said, my situation's bad, my husband's dead, you know he was a really good man, and all that, and his creditors now come and take my 2 boys as slaves. What did Elisha say? He didn't pull out his wallet and go, well, here's $10. He said, what do you have in your house? And you know what she responded with? Nothing. Except 1 little jar of oil. She had nothing except that 1 little jar with a bit of olive oil in it. The difference between nothing and that 1 little jar of olive oil is you can multiply that 1 little jar of olive oil. You can't multiply nothing. And we know what happened there. She went and got containers from all the neighbours and all that, and kept pouring the oil out of her little container into those jars until they were filled. It was a miracle of multiplication because she had something to start with. The point with that woman too is we all have something. When it comes to society, she was bottom of the barrel. She had nothing except 1 jar of olive oil. We might have nothing except 1 grain of mustard seed faith, but it's still something. Might not be much, but when you multiply it, things happen. The great thing about multiplication is in a mathematical term, it's called exponential. What that means is I can multiply 2. If I start with one thing and I multiply it by 2, how many do I have? 2. Let's multiply that by 2 again. I now have 4. Multiply that to 2 again. I now have 8. Again, 16. Again, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, and I could keep going, but I'm not going to. The point is, after 10 rounds of multiplication, the amount that you've got is huge. That's the power of multiplication. You do the same thing with addition, and you add 2 to 1 10 times, what do you end up with? 21. Not 2,000 and something. It's a big difference. Point 2b. The disciples came to Jesus with what they had. If you need a miracle, you've often got to be willing to give up the little that you've got. And when I say give it up, that doesn't mean just give it to anyone. You're effectively putting it into Jesus' hands and saying, please, I can't deal with this. I can't do it. This is what I've got. Let him do the rest. If the disciples hadn't have given Jesus those 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, the miracle wouldn't have happened. We can go one step further. If the boy hadn't have given the disciples the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, the miracle wouldn't have happened. You've got to be prepared to give up what you've got. What Jesus said, if you lay down your life for me, you'll find it. He who lays down his life for me will find it. Why? Because you're prepared to give up what you've got. Point number 3. Well, sorry, not so much point number 3. As the third thing that was required. The miracle required faith and availability. Now you might say, how did it require that? Well, first bit's up there. The disciples had to be available to hand out the bread and the fish. If they didn't hand out the bread and the fish, miracle wouldn't have happened. And you might say to me, Adam, well, Jesus multiplied the bread. I did a little bit of maths on this. And it is my view that while, yes, Jesus blessed it, the bread and fish multiplied as the disciples were handing it out. How do I come to that conclusion? Let's assume we've got 5,000 men. Let's assume they each get 6 slices of bread. Now, I'm going to say that's a very conservative figure because as one of the other Gospels say, these people have been with Jesus all day and Jesus was worried about them fainting on the way home, so they're going to be hungry. Now, the loaves of bread that I get have about 18 slices in them, 680 gram loaf. So let's say that's for 3 men. When you have 5,000 people, 5,000 men, keep in mind we're not including women and children here, at 6 slices of bread each, that equals 1,667 loaves of bread. Now, if you convert that to weight, that's 1,133 kilos, and Byron might be able to correct me here, but if I'm not mistaken, that's about the same weight as Shelley's car. You've got 12 disciples. Now, yes, I get that some of these guys were fishermen, and they could probably carry a lot, but I can't see Jesus having all this bread multiplying, and then 12 disciples running around with 120 kilos of bread and fish each, handing it out to 5,000 people. What's more likely is he broke bread, blessed it, handed it to his disciples, and as the disciples passed out, it kept multiplying. The widow's jar of oil didn't miraculously have suddenly 30 gallons of oil in a little jar. It multiplied as she poured it out. It just didn't run out. The other widow that fed Elijah, she had the flour jar and the oil. It didn't miraculously turn into 20 kilos of flour and 10 litres of olive oil. It just never ran out. It multiplied as it was used. So the disciples had to be available. They had to have faith, though. Now, if I was Jesus, let's say, and I had the bread and the fish, and I picked 12 people and said, here's a bit of bread and fish each, go feed those 5,000 people. What are you going to do? Laugh at me? Yeah, that's probably a pretty fair estimate. You see, a miracle doesn't occur without faith. In another part of the gospel, when Jesus goes back to his hometown, he couldn't do many miracles there because the people lacked faith. The faith of the disciples in this point is taking what they'd been given and having faith that the miracle is occurring as they hand it out. You look at James 2:18. I will show you by my faith by my deeds. How are the disciples showing their faith? Because they were actually taking the bread and handing it out. Now, I know we've had some scenarios over the years where we're doing catering and stuff, and Pastor Marilyn will get a number or something, or someone will get a number and we'll go, this is how many pizzas we need to order, or this is how much people we've got to cater for. But that's a little bit different than what the disciples were doing. What the disciples are doing is taking faith to a whole new level. That would be like catering, having enough food for 5 people, and as I think it was Debbie was dishing out the potato salad on the Christmas dinner, that would be like giving Debbie one thing of potato salad and saying, there we go, that's got to do all the plates. That's literally what they did. As they dish out the potato salad just keeps reappearing back in the container. You just keep dishing it out and dishing it out and dishing it out. That's the kind of faith that the disciples had to have. If they had taken it and gone, Jesus, this isn't enough to feed 10 people, let alone my section of 500, miracle wouldn't have happened. So the 3 things that were required: you need a situation, you need something that's insufficient, and you need faith and availability usually. Availability can be optional depending on the specific situation, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to be available. And that comes back to James 2:18. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. Come on, clicker. Don't fail me now. Oh, there we go. Right. John 6, verse 12. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." He's just had a miracle where he's effectively, let's be conservative and say he's just fed 12,000 people. Because it was 5,000 men, so let's assume they've all got a wife and let's assume half of them have got a kid. Probably lots of kids, but we'll be conservative and we'll say 12,000 people. If you do the numbers on the bread, we're now up to 2.5 tons, which is close to the weight of Byron's Land Cruiser. If we're talking about distribution again. But Jesus says, let nothing be wasted. Why? Why does Jesus say, let nothing be wasted? I went and had a look at a couple of commentaries on this because that's what you can do when you've got commentaries to look at. One said, God does not want us to waste his bounty. Yeah, okay. Fair point. Another one, faithfulness in the little things. To Jesus, who feeding the 5,000 was not too much, gathering the fragments was not too little. Okay? Another one took a different tack on it and said that Jesus' intention was nothing be lost in the same way that he desires none should be lost. Bit of a metaphor. And then I got to the 12 baskets left over and I'm like, why 12? Was that just a convenient number because that's how many disciples there were? Well, that didn't make sense because when you go to the feeding of the 4,000, I think it's 7 baskets left over. That was less people, so there should have been more food. And they started with more food too. They had 7 loaves, not 5. So blew that theory out the window. But then I looked up the number 12. 12 can symbolise completeness. It also symbolises God's power and authority. Maybe that's why there was 12 baskets. And then I thought back to the parable of the talents. And you might go, where are we going with the parable of the talents? The parable of the talents shows us the importance of stewardship. What we do with what God gives us. Now, the first 2 servants, they did everything right. They got a return. The second guy just buried his talent, and didn't get a return. He wasn't a good steward. Now, if you're a steward, you're put in charge of everything, not just the big stuff. So that means you need to manage everything. Now, if you're talking about that in charge of money, and anyone who's run a business can tell you, Mum can probably tell you from the church perspective as well, if you start out with $10,000 and you go, yep, we've, what's the word I'm looking for? When you know where it all went. We've accounted for, thank you. We've accounted for $9,500 of that. Does that cut it? The Australian Tax Office will tell you no. So will the United States IRS and just about every other taxation agency in the world. It doesn't cut it. Why? Because that's not the whole lot. As a steward, you're accountable for the whole lot. And I believe that's where Jesus was going when it came to the leftovers, because you see in Luke explains that Jesus instructed the people to sit down in groups of 50. Now, if you've got 5,000 men, let's just ignore the women and children for a minute, that's 100 groups. And you've got 12 baskets of leftovers. Let's just round the numbers down and say we had 10 baskets of leftovers. That is 1 basket of leftovers for every 10 groups. That means each group didn't have a lot of leftovers because they only filled 1/10 of a basket. When you've got the people sitting in that group, that amount of leftovers would seem inconsequential. But when you take 100 groups with that amount of leftovers, you've now got 12 baskets of food. That is not inconsequential. That is far more than they had to begin with. Simply because the leftovers were collected. And this is what got me when I was actually listening to the audio Bible. And Jesus' words, "Let nothing be wasted," stood out. That's why it's called "Don't Waste the Miracle." Because for us, hang on. Oh, yep, we covered that. Collecting the leftovers was a good stewardship. Because for us, it's easy to accept the big part of the miracle. The big miracles. The big things. You see, let's use a church building project. It's a big thing. This church went up debt-free. It's a big thing. And everyone rejoices in that. But do we do the same about the little miracles? Pastor Brian Marilyn having a week off. We could class that as a small miracle. Just saying, it doesn't happen very often. Someone coming to church and getting saved. That's a miracle. Being welcomed into a community to do an outreach. Believe it or not, that's a miracle, especially in this day and age. Having to purchase something and getting a really good deal on it, that's a miracle. Driving down Mary Street in Gympie and getting a car park. Now, that's not in the small category. I'm going to put that in the medium. That's a miracle. Literally. Getting a car park at Centro during Christmas rush. It's another miracle. Are we faithful to thank Him? Are we good stewards with the miracles that Jesus does in our lives every day? Or do we just treat them as run-of-the-mill? Should be right. Are we being good stewards with everything He's given us? Are we utilising it to the best of our ability? Or are we just doing an average, mediocre job with what we've been given? The disciples collected the leftovers. That's not a mediocre job. There's an old saying that I remembered yesterday. It's often used when referring to a difficult task. And this isn't sexist, but the saying is, this will separate the men from the boys. The saying is basically describing how when you have a group of people that are undertaking a specific task, they'll end up separated into two distinct groups. Those that are capable of carrying out the task and those that can't. You look at it on the surface and you might go, it's luck that one group succeeded and the other didn't. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find those that are capable of carrying out the task, they were committed to it, they trained for it, they educated themselves about it, they prepared themselves for it as best as they could. They didn't go into it half-heartedly, and they did everything they could to have the best chances to succeed. They didn't waste what they were given. Church, I want to challenge you. We're in 2023. We've been given an opportunity in 2023. We all know revival is close. It's not a matter of if, it is literally just a matter of when. But this church has got opportunities to impact and outreach our communities like never before. Church, we've got people asking us to do stuff. That doesn't happen. We have people coming to attend outreach type stuff, youth group for example, that want us to do it more. That want to know when it's on. That are getting so involved in it that last year in term 4, when we switched the weeks for various reasons between the leaders, the kids were so thoroughly convinced that it was on the other week because that's what we were doing. That we got to the first week in term 4 and we had some of the parents go, the kids were sure it was next week. We're like, no, it's definitely this week. What kids do you know that are going to take an event that happened in term 3 and manually count the weeks through to term 4 to work out when the next start date is before I have worked out what the next start date is? That's the opportunities we've got. But the question is, what are we going to do with them? Are we going to take those opportunities and use them to their fullest extent? Or are we just going to be average? Are we going to fully commit to expanding God's kingdom on this earth, or will we let other stuff get in our way? I've had to cut stuff out of my life. I've had some stuff that I wanted to do for a really, really long time that I would have had the opportunity to do in 23, and I had to send some emails and go, you know what, I can't do it. Because it clashes with stuff that we're doing for God's kingdom. Are we going to collect the leftovers? Or are we going to leave them to rot? And I want to leave you with that challenge. Shell, I don't know if you've got a song or something. But going into this year, church, I want to challenge you. Get involved. This isn't about expanding LCC. This is about expanding God's kingdom. Are we going to put our hand to the plough? Or are we just going to let it sit there?